The ferry from Brazzaville to Kinshasa turned out to be very interesting. We tried to get, well, we got up early so that we could get on the 9 o'clock boat, and in the end we were waiting until about 12 o'clock. It didn't take too long to do the passports and the customs, but there weren't very many vehicles queuing up, and when the boat turned up you could see why, because it was basically just a sort of motorised barge. It was only the width of the length of a car. So you had Chris and I on next to each other with Dan on behind, and really just the front wheel looking out onto the water as the boat then just filled with people and another car. They tried to move Dan out the way to put a car on, but it was obvious that it wasn't going to fit, so they found a space actually underneath some of the sort of the accommodation, the seating area, which was on a balcony, and they rammed the car in there. And then the boat sort of proceeded, and we were in the meantime actually sat still on our bikes with the side stand down, but really just sort of holding the bikes up with the brake on and in gear and ignition turned off to stop us sort of rolling into the water. We had no idea whether it was going to be particularly rough on the Congo, but we set off just surrounded by people, and generally they're pretty friendly, although there were a few fights on board. But then we sort of motored up the well, what really is the north bank of the river on the Brazzaville side, and then we linked up with another 2 boats that were their same type of boat, and to form this big sort of raft. And from there we motored up the river and sort of did a sort of a big U to get across to the other side, because the current on the Congo is so strong. And basically it was just full of people and goods to trade, and just great big boxes and bags and fabrics and all sorts of things. Actually on the crossing we were looking, they're sort of passing around this drink in a bottle. It was a sort of yellowy liquid, and it wasn't, you know, for sort of a good few minutes of watching people sort of passing around that we realised it was actually Congo river water that they were scooping out to the side, which was absolutely disgusting. So obviously we didn't partake. We stuck to our bottled water. Yeah, when we got to the other side, the Kinshasa side, it was just all hell. Luckily we were facing onto the pontoon. It was really a floating pontoon with a sort of a jetty, sort of a ramp that went up to where the customs area was, which is sort of unusual to take bikes up that sort of thing, but luckily we could get up onto the side. But before we had a chance to do that, basically everyone from our boat and the 2 boats that were next to us to create the raft just barged and pushed and shoved, but the captain, who was having a beer at the time on the side, told us that we couldn't go yet because we wouldn't be able to get up the ramp anyway because of the number of people. But the people just charged, passing these great big boxes over us, leaning them on panniers, pushing between the bikes, almost pushing Dan over. Chris did drive up onto the jetty and sort of hid off to one side, but we were really, Dan and I just left there to fend for ourselves against this pressure, enormous pressure from behind of all these people pushing up the jetty. So that was a little bit disturbing, but we made it through, and eventually we barged up on our bikes up the ramp, and they let us straight through into this sort of holding area, where we found the customs guy, and he disappeared off. Well, one of his lackeys disappeared off with our passports. So we're a bit concerned about letting passports out of our sight, because we've had that before, and you know, when you're in the Congo you really don't want to be without your passport, put it that way. But they came back stamped, and Dan went off and found the douane or the customs guy, and he came and inspected the bikes for the first time. In fact, it was Chris whose number plate was actually in the bag on the back of his bike. The customs guy didn't seem to mind, and it was one that Chris had actually cut out of a baby bath in Lamborghini, or in fact in Dende, which is on the border of Gabon and well, it's actually in Congo, but no, it's not. Sorry, it's in Gabon. It's on the border, just before the border with the Congo. And it was our last stop for New Year's Eve, basically, before we came into Congo Brazzaville. But he'd drawn onto that his number, because the previous one had got smashed off when probably when he tried to overtake a lorry, and the lorry drove him off the road, also on the way to Ndende. But it wasn't a problem, and we were just about to leave, having got our carnet stamped, and we were ready to go. And these people who'd, this man especially with a badge that looked a bit homemade came over, and he'd been with the customs guy, but we didn't realise that, I didn't realise that they weren't, you know, official. He came over and he started talking about the health and about how the bikes might be infected and they had to be, you know, disinfected, they had to be cleaned, and we'd have to pay a fee. And at the time where we'd parked the bikes was sort of in a little courtyard made by containers for the Red Cross with all their sort of provisions and things in, but you could get out the back, and really they sort of tried to block us in, but we just made excuses and began to push through. And then when everyone was ready, you know, Dan, who was the last person to be spoken to by this guy's mate, who was quite big, we couldn't just push by him, but Dan made some excuses and drove round, and then we literally just drove out past the guards on the gate, which was lucky, and escaped paying this. He didn't say what the cost of the cleaning would be, but knowing them, it would have been, you know, 5, 10, 20 pounds. It could be anything, whatever they feel like trying to charge you on the day. But it was just ridiculous. But we didn't mind because we escaped basically. So it was quite a good sense of accomplishment in that sense. And we're getting reasonably wise to these scams. We're pretty cynical now about when people are telling us that we must pay this and must pay that. And I think, you know, the travellers of a few years ago, you know, some of them might have been taken in, and you do find that the people crossing in their cars, you know, they're not able to just blast away, so they do seem to pay a lot more bribes, and that's what they tell us on the internet forums about, you know, taking things to give people. But we try our hardest, and very rarely, unless we're in a hurry and we have to get on, then we don't pay the bribes. We sit it out, and we are difficult, and we don't understand the language, and we put it all on this big show and just make life really difficult for them. So yeah, so that was the crossing from Brazzaville to Kinshasa.